The cold iron handle of the heavy glass door bit into LeBron's palm through the thin fabric of his wet sleeve. Outside, the gray December slush of downtown Cleveland was turning into a frozen crust under a heavy, bruised sky that seemed to press down on the city streets. Inside, the air was thick with the artificial warmth of heavy-duty heaters and the sterile scent of expensive leather and polished concrete. He pulled the oversized hood of his faded gray sweatshirt lower, letting the shadow fall across his face and the reading glasses perched low on his nose. He looked like any other middle-aged working man seeking refuge from the biting Ohio wind, his worn Nike sweatpants bearing faint streaks of dried white paint near the cuff. There were no cameras, no security details, and no flashing lights to announce his arrival at the threshold of the premium retail space he had funded. A sleek digital display on the far wall flickered with crisp, high-definition loops of historic basketball highlights, the amber light reflecting off rows of pristine sneakers arranged on floating steel shelves. To the casual eye, it was a temple of modern athletic luxury, a pristine monument to human achievement. But LeBron had read the internal emails, the quiet complaints buried deep within corporate servers, and his stomach had turned at the recurring phrases describing people being made to feel small. He walked slowly toward a pristine glass case in the center of the showroom, his movements deliberate and unhurried as he observed the space. Inside the case, resting on a velvet cushion, sat a flawless pair of the 2003 red and white sneakers that had marked his entry into the professional world. He didn't touch the glass, but his eyes locked onto the small, faded blue rubber band resting quietly on his own left wrist. The embossed text reads, "I promise. Sir, we ask that loitering customers keep moving if they aren't waiting for an active assistance ticket." The voice was sharp, cutting through the low hum of the ventilation system like a razor through paper. LeBron turned his head slowly, his expression remaining perfectly blank as he met the gaze of a woman in her mid-30s wearing a tailored black blazer. Her silver name tag read Victoria Vance, Managing Director, and her eyes were already scanning his frayed cuffs with a calculated, cold detachment. "I was just looking at the display," LeBron said, his voice dropping into a low, quiet rumble that barely carried past the glass case. "I had some questions about how the local youth voucher program is being handled at this location." Victoria's jaw tightened slightly, her posture stiffening as she stepped closer, effectively blocking his view of the historic display. "Those specific corporate community programs are handled strictly online through verified portals, and we do not process manual inquiries from the floor. This flagship location caters exclusively to high-end collectors and scheduled appointments, so if you don't have a purchasing intent, I must ask you to clear the floor for our incoming clientele." A young employee near the register counter, his name tag reading Toby, froze with a stack of leather cleaner cloths in his hands, his eyes widening as he stared intently at the profile beneath the gray hood. He took a hesitant step forward, a sudden spark of recognition dancing in his eyes. But Victoria shot him a warning glance that pinned him back behind the register. "I see," LeBron murmured, his hands remaining deeply buried in the pockets of his sweatshirt as he absorbed the dismissal without a single trace of defensive anger. "You believe some people don't fit the image of this room." Victoria didn't answer with words. She simply raised her chin, her silence carrying the immense weight of an unearned corporate pride. She turned her head slightly and signaled toward the front entrance where her nephew, Bradley, stood near the security monitors adjusting his gold watch. Bradley nodded quickly, a smug, self-righteous smile forming on his lips as he began walking toward the display case with two uniformed guards following closely behind. "Let's avoid a public scene," Victoria whispered, her voice carrying an edge of sharp authority as she looked down at LeBron's water-stained running shoes. "We have a standard of exclusivity to maintain here, and your presence is disrupting the visual flow of our presentation." LeBron looked at her for 3 long seconds, his eyes holding a profound, immovable calm that seemed to make the air in the immediate space grow heavy and still. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't identify himself, and he didn't resist as Bradley and the guards reached his side to guide him toward the exit. As his boots reached the wet mat by the front door, he stopped for a fraction of a second, his gaze sweeping over the polished concrete one last time, before he looked directly into Victoria's eyes. "I will return in exactly 9 minutes," LeBron said, his voice carrying an undeniable weight that caused the entire front desk staff to freeze mid-motion. "Have every single member of the management team and floor staff waiting in the main break room." Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the high glass storefront as the heavy door began to swing shut. "Sure thing, sir. We'll be sure to stop our entire operation for your return." But nobody in that room understood what was actually written on that piece of paper, resting in the pocket of his wet sweatshirt yet. The heavy digital clock above the entrance terminal ticked forward, its red numbers glowing faintly against the brushed steel frame as the 9-minute countdown began. Inside the main showroom, the pacing of the room slowed down drastically as the initial tension of the confrontation dissolved back into the sterile atmosphere. The low, mechanical hum of the hidden climate control units continued to far out a dry, artificial warmth that did little to thaw the icy dread lingering near the register. Victoria Vance walked slowly back toward the center display, her high heels clicking sharply against the polished concrete floor like the steady beat of a metronome. She pulled a silk handkerchief from her pocket and carefully wiped away a tiny, invisible smudge from the glass casing that housed the historic red and white sneakers. To her left, Bradley stood with his arms crossed over his tailored suit, his eyes scanning the security monitors with a lazy, self-satisfied satisfaction. Near the back of the showroom, Maeve Lindstrom adjusted her frayed denim apron as she moved a heavy wooden crate of premium leather protectant sprays onto a lower shelf. Her hands were rough, the skin around her knuckles cracked from years of early morning shifts and exposure to harsh industrial cleaning solvents in the unheated stockrooms. At 48 years old, her movements were slow but deeply methodical, honed by decades of survival in a small, fading Ohio coal town before she relocated to the city. Every 3 minutes, Maeve would glance quietly at the small silver watch on her wrist, calculating the exact amount of her upcoming paycheck down to the last penny. Half of every dollar she earned at the complex was wired directly to a specialized medical clinic in southern Ohio, where her younger sister was undergoing intensive respiratory treatments. She kept her head down and her lips pressed into a tight, thin line, having learned long ago that invisibility was the only true shield against corporate volatility. A few feet away, Clara Higgins pretended to organize a row of premium tech fleece hoodies on a minimalist steel rack, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed the fabric. At 23, she was a recent design graduate from a university in Cincinnati, her portfolio filled with vibrant sketches of retail spaces reimagined as open, welcoming community hubs. She had entered the company with a burning passion for the intersection of street culture and human storytelling, believing that every product carried a deeper narrative of human struggle. Instead, her first 3 months had been a slow, crushing lesson in institutional compliance and the cold physics of corporate profiling. She had watched quietly as Victoria and Bradley implemented subtle, unspoken rules to discourage local neighborhood kids from gathering near the historic displays after school hours. Clara had drafted 3 separate, highly detailed internal reports documenting these exclusionary practices, routing them carefully through the designated corporate HR portals. Each digital file had been formally acknowledged by an automated system, stamped with a generic tracking number, and buried permanently in an unmonitored digital archive. She had eventually stopped sending the reports, her initial idealism replaced by a thick, suffocating layer of daily anxiety and the constant fear of losing her livelihood. She remained silent, watching the floor from behind her display rack, an unwilling participant in a system that measured human worth by the brand of their apparel. In the center aisle, Toby Miller kept his eyes fixed on the wet footprints left by the man in the gray hoodie near the front door threshold. He knew every statistic, every significant game, and every historic detail of the man whose names were stamped onto the gold-rimmed plates beneath the sneaker displays. He remembered the iconic 2003 debut game, the immense pressure of a whole state resting on the shoulders of an 18-year-old kid from Akron who refused to break. The calm, unmovable certainty in the stranger's eyes during the confrontation had triggered an intense, terrifying realization in the back of Toby's mind. He opened his personal phone beneath the cash wrap counter, his thumb shaking as he typed a frantic search query into the corporate employee directory system. The screen flickered, loading a restricted executive profile that caused the breath to catch sharply in his throat as the red digital clock on the wall shifted down to 7 minutes remaining. Outside the tall glass doors, the cold December wind howled through the concrete canyons of downtown Cleveland, driving the frozen slush sideways across the dark asphalt. LeBron stepped into the backseat of the dark, unbadged SUV that had pulled silently to the curb, the heavy door shutting out the roar of the city with a dull, pressurized thud. He pulled off his wet reading glasses, placing them into the console compartment, and sat perfectly still in the dim interior light as water trickled from the edge of his gray hood. He leaned his head back against the leather headrest, his eyes closed as his fingers traced the smooth, familiar texture of the blue rubber band on his left wrist. The touch of the worn rubber was a powerful anchor, dragging his mind backward through 30 years of memory to a freezing January morning in 1996. He could still smell the damp, metallic scent of the radiator in the small, rented apartment in Akron, a space they had been forced to abandon just 3 weeks later. He remembered walking into a high-end department store on the west side of the city with his mother, Gloria, who had saved small flaw bis bills for 5 long months. She had tucked those crumpled ones and fives into a faded canvas purse, her hands shaking with a quiet excitement because her son had finally been invited to a regional junior basketball showcase. She wanted him to look professional, to step onto the hardwood with the same outward dignity as the children who came from the wealthy suburbs across the valley. They had traveled less than 4 aisles into the store before a floor manager in a sharp gray suit began following them, his eyes locked onto LeBron's oversized, hand-me-down winter coat. When Gloria gently asked to see a pair of dark leather Oxfords in her son's size, the manager hadn't looked at her face. He had looked only at the safety pin holding her purse strap together. He had leaned across the glass counter, his voice dropping into a polite but cutting whisper as he suggested they try the liquidator outlet 3 miles down the interstate. LeBron remembered the sudden, burning heat that had flooded his chest as an 11-year-old boy, the raw instinct to lash out or run away from the cold judgment in that room. But his mother had simply stood taller, her spine straightening like tempered steel, as she opened the canvas purse and calmly counted out $85 in small bills and loose quarters. She had looked down at her son with tears glistening in her eyes but an absolute, unshakable steel in her voice, telling him to never let another human being's limited perspective define his worth. She had told him to remember that exact feeling, not to carry it as a burden of hatred, but to use it as a solemn vow for the day he would eventually hold power. He had carried those words through every grueling high school practice, every championship fourth quarter, and every major corporate negotiation of his adult life. Success to him had never been about the accumulation of material luxury. It was about utilizing the platform he had earned to build a fortress where the vulnerable could stand without fear. The low buzz of his phone in the cup holder broke the silence of the vehicle, the screen illuminating with the name of his chief director of global operations. He picked it up, his voice dropping into that same quiet, controlled rumble that carried the immense gravity of a looming storm. "Alan, I am sitting outside the Cleveland flagship complex right now," LeBron said, his eyes opening to watch the frozen Suco form on the window pane. The internal reports regarding customer profiling were understated. The reality on the floor is significantly worse. There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long pause as the executive realized the weight of the situation. "What do you need from us, sir?" "I want the regional vice president, the head of corporate human resources, and our chief legal counsel at this location in exactly 6 minutes," LeBron commanded, his voice holding the same absolute authority he used to direct a championship huddle. "Pull 90 days of complete security footage from this showroom, specifically searching for interactions involving local neighborhood youth and minority patrons. Have their complete employment files ready on my terminal, and do not allow anyone in that building to leave before I return." He ended the call without waiting for a reply, his gaze shifting back to the faded blue band on his wrist, as the red digital clock on the building wall across the street ticked down to 5 minutes remaining. The heavy glass doors of the Apex assembly chimed softly as they swung open, letting in a swirl of frozen sungmu that dissolved instantly upon the heated concrete floor. A 15-year-old boy named Malakai Monroe stepped inside, his shoulders hunched against the biting cold as he clutched a worn leather gym bag tightly against his chest. He wore an old varsity jacket that was noticeably short in the sleeves, and his basketball shoes were salt-stained from the walk through the downtown slush. His eyes, bright and wide with a deep sense of reverence, immediately locked onto the central glass display where the historic 2003 red and white sneakers rested under the spotlights. Malakai reached into the deep pocket of his jacket and carefully pulled out a folded piece of paper, smoothing the edges with his thumb. It was an official Scholastic Excellence voucher from the local public school district, stamped with a bright red A report card grade on the back. "Can I help you find something, young man?" Victoria Vance appeared at the edge of the display case, her arms crossed tightly over her black blazer as her eyes swept over Malakai's frayed jacket cuffs. Her tone was polished but entirely devoid of warmth, her positioning deliberately cutting off the boy's path toward the premium retail shelves. Bradley moved closer from the security desk, leaning his shoulder against a concrete pillar with a lazy, watchful attachment that made the boy shift his weight nervously. "Yes, ma'am," Malakai said, his voice cracking slightly as he held out the folded paper with both hands. "I earned the Scholastic Excellence Award this semester at school. The program coordinator said I could redeem this voucher here for a pair of the team sneakers for the upcoming winter tournament." Victoria didn't take the paper from his hands. She merely glanced down at it, her expression hardening as she noticed a faint smudge of slush along the margin. "We do not accept manual physical vouchers from non-partner school districts at this flagship location during peak retail hours. Those specific community allocations are restricted to the clearance outlets on the periphery of the county, as our inventory here is reserved strictly for premium collectors." "But the flyer said any flagship center in the city," Malakai whispered, his fingers tightening on the edges of the paper as his chest fell with a sudden, crushing disappointment. "My mom is working a double shift at the trauma center and couldn't come with me, but she told me this was the right place." Victoria stepped forward, her shadow completely obscuring the boy's view of the historic display case, as her voice dropped into a harsh, final whisper. I don't care what your flyer says, and I don't have the floor staff available to verify questionable documents from unverified programs. This is a high-end luxury establishment, not a community distribution center, so I need you to clear the floor immediately before I have security assist you out. With a swift, cold motion of her hand, she took the folded voucher from his trembling fingers and dropped it carelessly into the small stainless steel waste bin beneath the cash wrap counter. Malakai froze, his jaw tightening as he looked down at the bin, his eyes filling with a raw, burning humiliation that seemed to paralyze him in the center of the room. Toby Miller watched the scene unfold from behind the register, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles turned white. But he remained frozen behind the desk, trapped by his own silence. Outside the frost-rimmed windows, standing completely motionless under the shadow of the concrete awning, LeBron James watched every single micro-reaction through the dark glass. He saw the boy's head drop, he saw the smug smile form on Bradley's face, and he felt the profound weight of a 30-year-old promise pressing heavily against his chest. The red digital clock on the wall shifted silently, down to 0 minutes remaining. The heavy glass door of the Apex assembly swung open, exactly as the red digits on the wall terminal struck 0. LeBron James stepped through the threshold, but the oversized gray hood was now pushed back, revealing the sharp, unmistakable lines of his face and the quiet, controlled fury burning within his eyes. He had removed the wet sweatshirt, revealing an immaculate white dress shirt under a tailored charcoal blazer, his massive frame completely dominating the physical space of the entranceway. Behind him, the sudden sound of heavy footsteps echoed against the polished concrete floor, as 3 black executive vehicles emptied their occupants at the curb. Alan Vance, the regional vice president, stepped into the showroom first, his face completely pale as he clutched a leather briefing folder against his chest with trembling fingers. He was followed closely by the chief corporate legal counsel, a sharp-eyed man named Marcus Vance, and the national director of human resources, who carried an active executive tablet displaying the complete personnel registry. Victoria Vance's triumphant smile vanished from her face in the span of a single heartbeat, her eyes widening in a terrifying wave of absolute recognition as she looked at the man she had ordered escorted out. Her breath caught sharply in her throat, her hands dropping limply to her sides, as she realized the catastrophic nature of the mistake she had committed in the name of corporate exclusivity. Bradley froze beside the concrete pillar, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as his gold watch caught the glare of the overhead spotlights. "Gather everyone in the main break room immediately," LeBron said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the building. His gaze did not linger on Victoria. Instead, he walked directly toward the small stainless steel waste bin beneath the cash wrap counter and knelt down with a slow, deliberate dignity. His large hand reached into the container, his fingers gently retrieving the folded, scholastic voucher that Victoria had discarded just moments before. He stood up slowly, smoothing the crumpled edges of the paper with his thumb before turning his head to look at Malakai, who was staring at him with a mixture of intense shock and sudden, overwhelming hope. Toby Miller stood behind the register, his knees shaking so violently he had to place both palms flat on the counter terminal to prevent himself from collapsing out of sheer shock. "Toby, take this voucher and pull the absolute best pair of championship team shoes we have in this building in a size 10. LeBron commanded, placing the paper gently onto the desk terminal. "And do not log it as a transaction. Log it as a debt that this corporation has owed to this community for far too long." The front staff moved like ghosts, shuffling silently toward the back corridor of the building, as the corporate executive team formed a grim perimeter behind their chief investor. The air inside the narrow hallway felt suffocatingly thin, the low hum of the ventilation units suddenly sounding like the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a waiting judge. But nobody in that room understood how deeply the foundation of their entire corporate hierarchy was about to shift within the next 9 minutes. The small break room felt as though the concrete walls were slowly pressing inward, trapping the 5 staff members who lined up against the plasterboard like defendants awaiting a final verdict. LeBron James stood in the center of the cramped space, his massive shoulders silhouetted against a framed corporate motivational poster that spoke of excellence as a shared journey. He did not sit down, nor did he offer any generic pleasantries. He simply paced the length of the linoleum floor with a slow, heavy stride that made the light fixtures overhead hum faintly. To his right, the chief legal counsel opened a sleek black laptop and turned the high-definition monitor directly Victoria Vance, who was leaning heavily against the counter for support. The screen immediately began flickering, with compressed multi-camera security feeds, the crisp digital timestamps rolling backward through 90 days of recorded floor operations. The first file showed a group of local teenagers in winter coats being systematically shadowed by Bradley from the moment they crossed the entrance mat. The next video file revealed an elderly working man wearing a Fate Mechanics uniform being pointedly directed toward the service exit before he could even approach the counter display. Clara Higgins watched her own image appear in the background of a third clip, her face drawn with a visible, silent misery as she stood by a clothing rack and did nothing to intervene. This digital registry represents 90 days of systematic profiling, 90 days of calculated exclusion, and 90 days of my name being utilized as a weapon to make ordinary human beings feel small. LeBron said, his voice dropping into a cold, level cadence that caused the room temperature to feel as though it had dropped below freezing. You did not fail this afternoon because you failed to recognize my face under a gray hood. You failed because you completely forgot the foundational purpose of why these doors were opened in this city. Victoria attempted to find her voice, her fingers clenching into the fabric of her black blazer as she looked up at the man who held her entire professional future in his hands. Mr. James, the corporate directive from the regional office required us to maximize the transaction values and protect the high-end aesthetic of the flagship layout. I was simply enforcing the standard of exclusivity that keeps our brand positioning at the top of the luxury retail market. The corporate legal counsel stepped forward, his expression completely blank, as he tapped the active screen of his executive tablet to bring up another file. September 14th, an official internal complaint was filed through the corporate whistleblower portal by Clara Higgins regarding discriminatory floor practices. At this location, the counsel leaded, his voice completely devoid of theatrical emotion. October 3rd, a second formal notification was uploaded, and on November 10th, a third highly detailed report was sent. LeBron turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Victoria's pale face with a heavy, immovable weight that silenced her before she could offer another corporate excuse. You did not protect a brand, Victoria. You protected your own narrow insecurity by building a system that measured a person's dignity by the cleanliness of their shoes. Victoria Vance felt the last remnants of her corporate composure crumble as the silence in the room stretched out, heavy and absolute. She looked down at the polished linoleum floor, her breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps as the reality of her total professional ruin settled over her like a heavy cloak. Bradley stood completely motionless beside her, his arms pinned to his sides, all his unearned confidence vanishing as he stared at the floor tiles. Your employment with this organization is terminated effective Immediately, LeBron said, his voice quiet but carrying an unyielding finality that left no room for negotiation or appeal. You will leave this building through the rear exit, and your corporate credentials have already been permanently deactivated across the entire national network. Mr. James, please? Victoria gasped, her eyes swelling with genuine tears as she took a desperate step forward, her hands shaking uncontrollably. I am a single provider, and I have spent my entire adult career climbing into this management position. If you cast me out with a corporate termination for discriminatory practices on my record, I will lose everything I have built over the last 10 years. You should have considered the weight of what people could lose when you threw a child's dream into the waste bin under your desk. LeBron replied, his expression remaining completely hard as he looked at her. Your cruelty was not a temporary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate choice you made every single day to make vulnerable human beings feel small. He signaled to the two uniformed guards waiting near the corridor, who stepped into the narrow break room and firmly guided Victoria and Bradley toward the rear's security door. As she passed Toby Miller, Victoria reached out and gripped his sleeve for a fraction of a second, her face twisted with a mixture of intense bitterness and sudden, deep regret. "This is not fair, Toby," she whispered hoarsely, her voice breaking completely as the tears smudged her makeup. "I was simply protecting the visual standards of the company." "No, Victoria, you were only protecting your own authority," Toby said quietly, gently pulling his sleeve away from her trembling fingers. "There is an immense difference between maintaining a luxury standard and destroying a person's basic human dignity." The security door clicked shut behind them, the sound echoing through the small room like a hammer hitting an anvil. LeBron turned back to face the remaining three staff members, his eyes softening slightly as he looked at the heavy emotion visible on Clara and Maeve's faces. The initial terror of the execution had cleared from the small space, leaving behind a thick, quiet atmosphere of profound accountability. "We are not finished here," LeBron said, his low voice carrying a new, quiet intensity that caused Toby to straighten his shoulders. "The rot did not leave this building through that rear door just now. It is still lingering in the silence of everyone who watched it happen and chose comfort over courage." LeBron walked slowly over to the small break room table, his large hands resting flat against the edge of the laminate surface as he looked at Toby, Clara, and Maeve. The corporate directors remained standing near the doorway, their tablets dimmed as the focus shifted entirely from legal protocols to a deeper human reckoning. The artificial warmth from the ventilation system continued to hum, but the air felt clear now, stripped of the heavy tension that had filled the room just moments before. "I am giving each of you a choice this afternoon, and it is a choice that will define the trajectory of your professional lives. From this moment forward," LeBron said, his voice dropping into a quiet, reflective cadence. "You can choose to walk away from this building right now with a generous 4-month severance package and a clean professional reference from our corporate office. You can take that fresh start and find a room where the standards are lower, and your silence will never be questioned or challenged." He paused, letting the weight of the alternative sink into the quiet space before he continued, his eyes locking onto Clara's tear-stained face. "Or you can choose to remain in this building and help me dismantle this entire structure from the ground up to build something that actually honors this community. It will mean longer hours. It will mean being held to a standard of absolute human transparency, and it will mean facing your own past failures every single day on this showroom floor." Toby took a deep breath, his hands coming out of his apron pockets, as he stepped forward to face the chief investor without a single trace of his former hesitation. "I am staying, Mr. James," Toby said, his voice steadying as he spoke from his heart. "I spent the last 3 months convincing myself that I was just a part-time student who didn't have the authority to speak up when I saw a kid being humiliated in my own neighborhood. I am staying because Malakai deserves to see a person behind that register who remembers exactly what we almost took from him today. Maeve wiped her rough hands against her denim apron, her weathered shoulders rising as she stood at her full height beside the young design graduate. In the town I came from, we were taught that staying invisible was the only way to keep your head above water and keep your family safe, Maeve said, her thick Appalachian accent carrying a profound, heavy weight. But a safety that requires you to watch a child's heart get broken in the name of a luxury brand is not a safety I want to live with anymore. I am staying to build a room where nobody is ever made to feel like they are too poor to breathe the air. Clara looked up, her eyes bright with a sudden, fierce determination as she opened her notebook and looked directly into LeBron's gaze. The corporate system buried my reports because they only cared about the transaction numbers on the spreadsheets, Clara said, her voice carrying a sharp, clear resonance. I am staying to use every single design concept I have ever created to transform this sterile complex into a place where every human being who walks through our doors feels like they belong to a family. LeBron nodded slowly, a small, genuine expression of pride softening the hard lines of his face as he looked at the three transformed workers. Tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock, the Apex Assembly ceases to exist as a luxury boutique, and we begin building the foundation of the Cleveland Legacy Hub. Toby, you are the new Assistant Director of Operations, training under Allen to assume full management of this facility within the next 6 months. Maeve, you are the Director of Human Experience, and Clara, you have complete creative control to redesign this entire layout into a center for local education and mentorship. He turned toward the breakroom door, where Malakai was waiting quietly, with his new championship sneakers clutched in his arms. His mother, Dr. Evelyn Monroe, standing protectively by his side. The work ahead of us is going to be uncomfortable, and it will require you to challenge every single corporate habit you have learned, LeBron said as he prepared to lead them back onto the showroom floor. But when you choose transformation over comfort, you build a legacy that can never be measured by a profit margin. 6 months later, the morning sun broke over downtown Cleveland, painting the glass facade of the building in warm shades of amber and gold. The monolithic silver sign that had once read Apex Assembly had been replaced by bold, elegant lettering that hummed with a different kind of energy. The Cleveland Legacy Hub. LeBron James pulled his car up to the curb at exactly 7:30 a.m., stepping out into the crisp, biting winter air without his old gray hoodie, wearing only a simple black t-shirt and jeans. He looked toward the large front windows, where the sterile, unapproachable sneaker displays had been completely cleared away to make room for something far more human. The glass now showcased large, high-definition photographs of local neighborhood children, public school teachers, and everyday working people from the surrounding Ohio communities. Below each portrait was a small, hand-painted caption, detailing their personal journeys, their academic triumphs, and their contributions to the local streets. He pushed through the front door, the familiar chime sounding through a space that had been completely reimagined by Clara's design team as an open, light-filled sanctuary. Half of the floor remained dedicated to historic athletic footwear, but the entire back half had been transformed into a vibrant community center filled with study tables, digital learning terminals, and a small wooden half-court where children were already gathering after school hours. Toby Miller stood near the main counter, reviewing the morning schedule on his executive tablet, his posture carrying a deep, quiet confidence that had completely replaced his old anxiety. He looked up as LeBron approached, a genuine smile forming on his face as he welcomed the chief investor into the space they had built together from the ashes of corporate exclusion. Maeve Lindstrom was already in the education wing, carefully arranging stacks of textbooks and fresh supplies for the afternoon tutoring sessions. Her rough hands moving with an absolute, undeniable sense of purpose. The room no longer smelled of cold, expensive leather and industrial solvents. It smelled of fresh coffee, printed paper, and the vibrant, chaotic warmth of a living community. As LeBron turned to look at the central glass display case, he noticed that the 2003 red and white sneakers were still there. But resting directly beside them was a small, faded blue rubber wristband bearing the words "I promise." A shadow fell across the concrete floor as the front door chimed once more, and an elderly man entered the building wearing heavy, mud-caked work boots and a weathered canvas coat that had a tear near the pocket. He stopped near the threshold, his eyes moving nervously around the beautiful room as his shoulders hunched with familiar defensive hesitation that signaled he felt he didn't belong. Toby did not hesitate for a single second. He stepped out from behind the cash-wrap desk, his movements deliberate and warm as he walked directly toward the stranger, with his hand extended in an absolute gesture of respect. LeBron watched the interaction unfold from the shadow of the back corridor, his chest tightening with a profound, quiet emotion as he saw Toby kneel down to greet the man's young grandson who had slipped in behind him. He reached down and touched the blue band on his own wrist, knowing that his mother Gloria's decades-old promise had finally found a permanent home in the heart of this city. The true value of the room was no longer measured by the luxury items resting on the floating steel shelves, but by the invisible, unyielding fortress of human dignity they had built together, one choice at a time.